what I look for in an anime is how much the animators actually bring a style to it.
Yeah, I think
This one looked generic to me.
yeah, which I like. I like. This
I dislike.
Hi, I'm Good Cop. That's Bad Cop, and we just watched Weathering with You, a Japanese anime. But aside from that, Bad Cop. What did we just watch?
Are we really going with those names? Okay, we just watched a Climate Change Denialist anime. It's an anime, nonetheless, but one that disguises its climate change agenda, or rather its anti-climate change agenda.
It's like what Scott Adams says. You're watching two movies on the same screen. Because what I watched was an urban fantasy teen romance.
It's a science fiction romance anime, by which we mean it's a boy meets girl story in which there are some science fiction elements.
I would call it fantasy actually. It's more...
A boy runs away from home, ends up in Tokyo, where it's been raining continuously, as in 24/7, literally every minute of the day for weeks and weeks and weeks, and he runs into a girl who he discovers has the power to stop the rain.
Only for a short time.
But she does it with a 100% success rate.
By praying. So he convinces her to start this sunshine girl business.
Basically, people pay to have a spot of good weather. Basically, we find out over the course of the romance, the developing romance between the boy and the girl, that there are actually costs to pay for exercising such supernatural and magical powers.
Which, of course, we all know since we all have watched Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Yeah, but aside from that, I think it's pretty much a plotless movie. It's more atmospheric. There's no real narrative drive to it, but it still works.
I would slightly disagree with you. There is a plot in that there is a development of the relationship between the boy and the girl, and also between the boy and the adopted family.
Yeah, I mean,
between the boy and the family he adopts, or the runaway boy and the family he adopts in Tokyo. Because part of what interested me about this movie is the runaways and orphan setup. The boy is a runaway, the girl is an orphan, and they've got to find a way to function in normal society. The boy has to evade child protective services and the police, and so does the girl.
Yeah, but for me that felt more like a slice of life. I'm taking plot in the Hollywood sense of having a problem presented that needs to be solved urgently.
Right. So there are two problems that need to be solved actually in this film. One is, of course, the more realistic plot about how a runaway and an orphan can survive in an urban society, in a modern urban society, with all kinds of checks and ID verifications, especially if they both need to earn money and earn money to live on their own. And of course, the second problem is the one that the director and writer Shinkai Makoto is more interested in, which is what happens when it's time for the shaman to pay the full cost of her powers.
Yeah, but those weren't like really presented as like urgent things that they were working on.
It's more of a slow burn, yes,
yeah,
I agree.
They were more like in the background. Yeah.
I don't know. Do you think it's good storytelling or bad storytelling then?
It's different.
At least for this film.
It was okay. I think it's just a different from the standard Hollywood style, but this is anime, so you kind of judge the overall movie differently, because for anime, it's not just the story, but the animation itself that is also part of what interests you in the movie. So I guess now we have to come to how much of an anime fan Bad Cop is.
Bad Cop used to be involved in the anime club in university.
Yeah, but okay, like what anime have you liked or disliked? What are your views on anime?
Well, I think there's been a huge change in the sensibility of anime if you compare what used to be mainstream in what used to be mainstream story, what used to be a mainstream story in a typical anime from the 1990s and 2000s, and compare it to what is acceptable and mainstream in anime today.
You're talking about story.
Yeah, I'm talking about storytelling in anime.
No, I'm talking about the animation itself.
Animation itself, I think I'm more of a fan of early Studio Ghibli, where it was all hand-drawn.
Did this look hand-drawn to you?
No, it actually looked animated.
You mean 3D computer animation?
Yes, it looked computer animated. Especially that there are a lot of scenes where they showcase, the 3D effects of the
when the camera spins around.
When there's a camera spinning or when there's a pan, and you can see it's obviously quite a lot of it is done as a modern computer animation these days.
I think that's an interesting aspect, because my guess is that they used your standard 3D modeling like Pixar uses, but I think they purposely kind of flattened it so it wouldn't look so 3D.
Yeah, I think it's a style that Japanese anime started developing after their first experiments kind of fell flat with the public when they tried to do more or less 3D computer animation, and it wasn't very well received. So they went back to having a 3D environment, but the characters were always flattened.
Yeah, because I actually went for an animation festival in Singapore many years ago, maybe like 15 years, and there was a talk by the Transformers animation guy, and he actually talked about it, how they developed this special software to actually flatten their 3D models to give it the old classic hand-drawn 2D look.
Even though they are technically still 3D models, they move and their physics in the world are 3D, but for the purposes of rendering, they're rendered as 2D.
Which I thought was their own sensibility. I didn't know that the public actually didn't like it, and I was thinking, what, these guys are going too extreme. Just give us the 3D. Nobody cares.
But as it turned out, at least in Japan, people hated the look of 3D animation.
But for me, it's not so much the actual 2D versus 3D itself, but more of just the look and feel, the rendering of individual frames.
And I think the rendering and how cell versus hand-drawn versus computer assisted. What I look for in an anime is how much the animators actually bring a style to it.
Yeah, I think
this one looked generic to me.
Yeah, which I like.
I dislike.
This is the generic pastel anime style that has been around for a few decades at least.
It's called quick and cheap to animate.
I don't know, it looks good. So
it looks okay, but it does not evoke any emotion. say, if you compare the landscapes and the cityscapes of this film to the cityscapes of, let's say, a Studio Ghibli film, there's a lot of character that is lost in the so-called generic style.
It's kind of hard to compare because Studio Ghibli rarely, if ever, does like modern cities. So there's inherently is more nostalgic already. But for me, the rendering style, together with the story
and the character designs, all very generic. In fact, the story is quite generic, aside from the climate change denial angle.
But I felt that it did give a rather immersive atmosphere. You really do feel like you're in Tokyo, living their lifestyle.
That's because I think most of the iconic scenes of Tokyo are there. There's the shrine. There's a very famous shrine. There's the very famous Tokyo Tower, and there's the very famous pedestrian crossing.
Oh no!
That everyone has in their photographs, as well as in every other anime.
Oh no! For me, it's their daily life, the rooms, their offices, their small roads, and together it just felt very, very real. Together with the story.
Yeah, it felt real, but it felt generic as well.
But that's because for me, I do like the generic anime style.
Well, he's a good cop and I'm the bad cop.
And looking at the credits, which Bad Cop totally ignored, I noticed that the production IG and Studio 4 Degrees C were credited at the end. So they are like two of the top animation studios around. Production IG did almost all of Mamoru Oshii's anime since at least the first Ghost in the Shell. Studio 4 Degrees C, I'm not too familiar with their commercial work, but they did do a demo short called Dimension Bomb, which was in one of their Genius Party showcase compilations, and that's an amazing piece of work. You should really check it out if you can. I think they were following the director's vision. He probably called for this generic look.
In fact, the generic look is what Makoto Shinkai is known for in his previous films, such as such as Voices from a Distant Star, Your Name,
both of which were very successful.
Both of which were also science fiction, high concept science fiction anime.
I would still consider them fantasy.
Well, the first one was more science fiction, right? Voices from a Distant Star. Concept. Boy is sent off to fight an interstellar war. Girl remains on Earth, and they continue communicating with a time lag between them lengthening dramatically as the movie goes on. That is classic science fiction. Your Name, I think, you're right, it's more fantasy. Boy and girl swap bodies. But you can see how Makoto Shinkai's career has started off as pretty unique and has become pretty generic
but it's
in recent years.
It always seems to be like in the teen romance genre.
Because I think the teen romance genre is highly lucrative in Japan right now. Not just in terms of anime, but also in light novels and computer games.
And the theater that we went to was packed full of teens.
Well, about the climate change angle, which Good Cop doesn't see, but I think I see, is that Well, obviously, this film is about climate change, but it's about climate change in a very weird way. Tokyo in this story is facing torrential rainfall, uninterrupted. You could say it's a science fiction film that follows the tenets of climate change theory. I mean, orthodox climate change theory, right? Some places get unreasonably hot and some places get flooded all the time now.
I would see more of something like The Day After Tomorrow, where it just it's not about global warming, it's just about climate change. Which anyway, I think climate change is just a cop out from making a stand and saying yes, the world is warming. So if you call it climate change, any change, you can say, hey, yeah, we are right, the climate is changing.
Well, that's because Al Gore said in his famous documentary, it's not strictly global warming because global patterns become more chaotic, they become more extreme. So some places get hotter and drier and some places get wetter.
So it's heads I win, tails you lose.
That's Al Gore for you.
So,
but the weird angle about this film is that, you know, while there is some acknowledgement of climate change, the reasoning or how it's presented is utterly fantastical. I mean, aside from saying that a girl has powers to stop the rain or to change the weather, the film actually goes on to explain that, look, the climate change isn't caused by man. The weather has always been chaotic. And that's where the climate change denial angle comes in, you see. The film doesn't actually blame humanity or human activities for climate change. It just says, you know, well, weather's been chaotic. In fact, it's only in the past 200 years that, you know, it became regularized, but humanity shouldn't think that weather is something predictable.
Oh, well, that's assuming that the movie is saying that this is real life, but the movie is not. The movie is saying like this is a fantasy. This is not real. So I don't see any.
Actually, the author admitted in some interviews that he wrote the novel and then made it into anime because, well, sorry. Actually, in some interviews, the author states that he wrote the novel that led to this anime because of his fascination with the climate change debate.
Yeah, but it doesn't come across. Whatever his intentions were, the movie comes across as
more of a generic boy and girl movie.
And the rain part is like really magical, fantastical, not industry driven.
For me, I didn't really care much about the fantasy aspect of this film. I cared a lot more about the runaway and orphan part of this film.
Yeah, I think the characters work. You do care for the characters.
I cared for the characters and their predicaments far more than the fantastical setup or the story.
But it's not just a drama. There are some light moments which I did not laugh at, but the audience around me did.
Japanese humor, I guess. We feel more for the characters rather than the story, I believe, because they have real problems.
They spent time showing us their situation.
Which sadly, after showing us the situation, sort of everything is set aside for the fantastical part of the story. I mean, that's a director's choice, I'm sure. And it to be fair, it is his choice. But the setup of the runaway boy and the orphan girl and a brother, I feel, was actually the part of the movie that felt real to me as opposed to generic. It's a call out to an earlier movie by Hirokatsu Koreeda called Nobody Knows, which of course was about was a plottless slice of life movie about what happens to a family after their single mother dies, and they fend for themselves as long as they can until the authorities are alerted to their situation and everything falls apart. But the progression is completely different because I think the sensibility is different. Shinkai Makoto obviously wants to tell a fantasy story and a love story, and a very generic story at that.
I think it's very much oriented towards teenagers. So this is not a very adult oriented movie. Whereas for me, I'm more of like a Mamoru Oshii fan. I think like Satoshi Kon is overrated. I didn't really like any of his stuff.
Actually, if you compare Shinkai Makoto to Satoshi Kon, I think, I don't think Satoshi Kon comes across as the overrated one. He at least tried to tell very interesting, original-esque stories that were very meta.
Yeah, that's just it. You see, he had this like reputation for doing that kind of stuff. Whereas I don't think
Postmodern, hip.
I don't think Shinkai has such an inflated reputation.
For Japanese anime, if we were to compare this unorthodoxy to Japanese anime itself, I think the closest analog I can find to it is Wolf Children from 2012, which was, while being a story about of a single parent raising a kid in a rural village and refusing to to let them socialize with anyone else because kids are actually werewolves. It's actually about homeschooling. It's a very pro homeschooling movie.
Well, I think it comes down to like how much do you want to look at a movie in terms of its themes, or how much you just want to look at the story.
Because I think there's not much to look at the story, which is why we're forced to look at its themes.
It's a teen romance. That's
it's very generic. I wouldn't say it's painfully generic, but I would say that there were a lot of details outside the teen romance that grabbed our attention a lot more.
Not mine.
Well, I mean, obviously, he didn't think much about the he wasn't grabbed by the climate change spin, but he was still grabbed by the orphan and runaway theme. Yeah.
So definitely watch it if you like simple, light-hearted romances, especially if you're a teenager.
Otherwise, if you really like anime and have been watching anime for the past 20-30 years and you're kind of an old dude or old lady, this is probably too generic for you. And that's all we got for you.
Bye.